My name is Zora. I am 32 years old, and for 6 years my family treated me like an absolute ghost. But last Friday night they walked uninvited into my fully booked five-star restaurant, shoved past the hostess, and commandeered my VIP booth. My father did not ask for a menu. Instead, he slammed a legal contract onto the linen tablecloth and demanded 20% of my life's work, or he would have my landlord shut me down by Monday morning. What he did not know was that I had spent those 6 years building an empire, and I was about to serve them the exact kind of justice they deserved. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own table when your family refused to give you a seat. The kitchen at Sable and Smoke was a beautifully choreographed symphony of heat, steel, and adrenaline. It was a Friday night in the heart of Atlanta, and my restaurant was operating at peak capacity. I stood at the expedition pass, carefully wiping the rim of a plate featuring braised oxtail croquettes over a spiced plantain puree. The ticket machine was printing a relentless stream of orders. The air was thick with the scent of smoked paprika and searing wagyu, and I was exactly where I belonged. At 32 years old, I was the executive chef and sole owner of the most sought-after Afro-fusion dining experience in the city. Getting a table on a weekend required booking 2 months in advance. I had built this sanctuary from scratch, transforming my culinary vision into a reality that demanded respect. I was just reaching for a pair of plating tweezers when the earpiece tucked beneath my chef coat buzzed with static. It was Julian, my general manager, and his voice was tight with an anxiety I had never heard from him before. He told me there was a situation at the front door. A party of 4 had just pushed right past the host's stand, completely ignoring the waitlist and the protests of my staff. They had marched directly into the main dining room and physically seated themselves at the reserved corner VIP booth. I frowned, asking Julian why security had not already escorted them out to the street. There was a heavy pause on the radio before Julian spoke again, his tone dropping to an uncomfortable whisper. He said they claimed to be my family. My hands froze. The ambient noise of the kitchen, the clattering of pans, the shouting of orders, the hissing of flames, all of it suddenly faded into a muted hum. For 6 years, my family had operated as if I did not exist. I wiped my hands on a clean towel, taking a slow, measured breath to push down the sudden spike of adrenaline in my chest. I told my sous chef to take over the pass, untied my apron, and stepped out of the kitchen into the dim, ambient glow of the dining room. The restaurant was alive with the low murmur of wealthy Atlanta patrons, the soft clinking of crystal glasses, and the smooth rhythm of live jazz playing in the background. I navigated through the crowded floor, my posture straight and my expression carefully blank. As I approached the velvet-lined VIP booth in the back corner, the ghosts of my past materialized into sharp, painful reality. There they were sitting at a table they had no right to occupy. My mother, Vivian, was draped in a pristine, cream-colored designer suit, her hair styled to perfection, looking every bit the high-society megachurch matriarch she prided herself on being. Beside her sat my sister Aaliyah, the golden child who could do no wrong, wearing an outfit that cost more than my first culinary school tuition payment. Next to Aaliyah was her white husband Bryce, leaning back against the plush seating with an arrogant, entitled smirk on his face. And at the head of the table was my father, Jeremiah. He wore a custom-tailored suit that projected the wealth of his regional logistics company, his jaw set in that familiar, rigid line of absolute authority. I stopped at the edge of their table, looking down at the 4 people who had discarded me. No one smiled. No one offered a greeting. The air between us was thick with years of unspoken resentment. My mother spoke first, breaking the silence with the effortless cruelty I remembered so well. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my chef coat with obvious distaste. She casually remarked that I still smelled like grease and roasted onions. With a dismissive little laugh, she told me she thought owning a restaurant meant I could finally afford to hire people to do the dirty, lower-class work for me. The insult was designed to shrink me, to remind me of my place in her eyes. It was the same tone she used when I was a teenager, constantly reminding me that I was a rough edge in her perfectly polished world. I did not flinch. I kept my voice perfectly level, informing them that they did not have a reservation and that this table was booked for paying guests. I politely suggested they leave before I had my security team remove them from the premises. My father Jeremiah scoffed loudly, leaning forward and placing his elbows on the pristine white tablecloth. He told me not to be ridiculous, acting as if my rules and my boundaries were merely suggestions. He stated that a father did not need a reservation to see his own daughter, but his eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of any parental affection. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents. He did not ask for a menu. He did not ask how I had been. He raised his hand and forcefully slapped the contract down onto the table, the sharp smack of paper against wood cutting through the gentle jazz music surrounding us. He pushed the document across the table until it touched my hand. Jeremiah looked me dead in the eye, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register that he usually reserved for intimidating his corporate rivals. He told me that they were not here for the food. He demanded that I sign that contract right now, transferring 20% of my restaurant's equity directly into the holdings of his logistics firm. He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, and delivered an ultimatum that made the blood run cold in my veins. He told me that if I did not sign over a fifth of my life's work to him immediately, he would make a single phone call and ensure that my landlord shut my entire business down by Monday morning. I let the threat hang in the air for a fraction of a second. Then I laughed. It was not a nervous chuckle or a polite deflection. It was a full, genuine laugh drawn directly from the sheer audacity of the man sitting in my restaurant. The sound carried over the gentle jazz playing from the corner stage, causing a few heads at the nearby tables to turn in our direction. My father's jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched near his ear. He was not used to being laughed at. In his world, his trucking and logistics empire made him a king. He expected people to bow when he issued a command. But we were not in his warehouse. We were in my dining room, a space I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. Before Jeremiah could unleash whatever tyrannical lecture he had prepared, Bryce leaned forward. He placed his forearms on the pristine linen, a smug, perfectly practiced corporate grin spreading across his face. Bryce always had that specific kind of entitlement, the kind that came from marrying the golden child of a wealthy family and assuming their power was his own by proxy. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked up at me like I was a stubborn tenant who had missed rent. He told me that my father was not making an empty threat. Bryce proudly announced that as a senior broker for the commercial real estate firm that managed this exact building, he had intimate knowledge of my lease agreement. He tapped a well-manicured finger against the paperwork on the table. He said he had personally reviewed my file and found a hidden zoning clause regarding commercial exhaust and refuse management. According to his firm, my kitchen output exceeded the allowable limits for this specific commercial district. Bryce smiled, showing perfectly white teeth, and explained that all it took was one signature from him to declare me in material breach of my contract. He said he could have the city lock my doors, seize my equipment, and tie me up in litigation for years. He told me I would be bankrupt before I even got a court date. He spoke with the casual cruelty of a man who destroyed livelihoods before his morning coffee. Aaliyah sat back and took a delicate sip of her sparkling water, looking thoroughly entertained by the ambush. She muttered that I should just sign the paper and stop embarrassing myself in front of all these nice people. I looked at my sister, then at my mother, whose face was a mask of haughty disdain, and finally down at Bryce. I did not step back. I did not cower. I leaned in, resting my hands on the edge of their table, bringing myself right into their space. I could smell my mother's overpowering floral perfume mixed with Bryce's expensive, aggressive cologne. I looked directly into my father's eyes and asked him if this was supposed to be a repeat of the past. I asked him if this was like the night he kicked me out of his house 6 years ago with a single black plastic trash bag because I chose culinary school over law school. I kept my voice low, but the absolute ice in my tone made Bryce drop his smug smile. I reminded my father of the exact words he screamed at me from his front porch while Aaliyah stood in the warm, brightly lit window, watching me shiver in the rain. He had told me I would be crawling back within a month, begging for his money. I asked him if he really thought I had spent the last 6 years building a multi-million-dollar culinary brand without learning how to read a basic commercial lease agreement. I asked if they truly believed I was still the terrified 26-year-old girl they threw away like garbage. My mother gasped softly, glancing nervously at the tables around us to see if anyone from her social circles was eavesdropping. She hissed at me to lower my voice and show some respect to my family. I ignored her entirely, keeping my gaze locked on Bryce. I told him he was out of his depth. I told him that my zoning permits were bulletproof, signed off by the city council and handled by real estate lawyers who charged more per hour than he made in a week. I watched the confidence drain from his eyes as he realized I was not intimidated by corporate jargon. Bryce's face flushed a deep, angry red. The easy arrogance vanished, replaced by a defensive hostility. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out another document. This one was printed on heavy official legal paper bearing his firm's letterhead. He slammed it down right next to my father's contract. It was a drafted 48-hour eviction notice. Bryce pulled a heavy silver pen from his pocket and clicked it with a sharp metallic snap. He held the pen out to me, his hand hovering over the eviction notice. The high-end clientele at the adjacent tables were definitely watching us now, their conversations trailing off, as they observed the confrontation in the VIP booth. Bryce told me that I had two choices. I could sign the 20% equity transfer to my father, or he would sign the eviction notice right here, right now, effectively ending my career in front of half the city's elite. He cornered me, pen at the ready, waiting for me to break. I stared at the silver pen in Bryce's hand, hovering just inches above the drafted eviction notice. He looked incredibly proud of himself, entirely convinced that he had played the ultimate trump card. My mother wore a satisfied, thin-lipped smile, expecting me to crumble into tears and beg for mercy. My father sat back, crossing his arms over his broad chest, waiting to collect his 20% equity like a king collecting taxes. They truly believed they had cornered me. They thought I was still the 26-year-old girl who used to cry in her bedroom when they told her she was a failure. I let the threat hang in the heavy air of the dining room for a fraction of a second. Then I laughed. It was not a nervous chuckle or a polite deflection to save face. It was a loud, genuine laugh, drawn from the absolute absurdity of their arrogance. The sound cut through the ambient jazz music, causing a few wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables to pause their conversations and glance over at our booth. Bryce's smug grin faltered. His hand remained suspended in the air, but the pen twitched slightly. He demanded to know what I found so amusing about losing my entire livelihood. I stopped laughing and leaned forward, resting my palms flat against the pristine white linen. I brought my face so close to his that I could smell the sharp, aggressive notes of his expensive cologne. I told Bryce to go ahead and sign it. I challenged him to put his ink on that paper right now. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away every ounce of emotion until nothing was left but cold, hard reality. I asked him if he honestly believed I had spent the last 6 years building a multi-million-dollar culinary brand from scratch, without learning how to read a commercial lease agreement. I reminded him that commercial evictions for zoning violations require municipal citations, a formal review board hearing, and a minimum 30-day cure period. They do not happen because a mid-level broker trying to impress his father-in-law scribbles his name on a piece of firm letterhead on a Friday night. Bryce swallowed hard. A bead of sweat formed at his hairline, gleaming under the warm amber lighting of the VIP section. He looked quickly toward my father for backup, but Jeremiah remained dead silent, his dark eyes narrowing, as he realized his son-in-law might have critically overplayed his hand. I did not give them a moment to regroup. I pulled my personal cell phone from the pocket of my chef coat and placed it on the table right next to his fake eviction notice. I looked Bryce dead in the eye and recited the full name and direct extension of his firm's chief executive officer. I told Bryce to pick up my phone and call his boss. I said we should put him on speakerphone right here in the middle of my dining room. We could ask the CEO if he authorized one of his junior brokers to use company letterhead to blackmail a high-paying commercial tenant over a fabricated zoning clause. The color completely drained from Bryce's face. He looked at the phone as if it were a live explosive. He knew, and I knew, that making that call would result in his immediate termination for gross professional misconduct. He slowly lowered his pen, pulling his hand back from the table as if the tablecloth had caught fire. Without waiting for his surrender, I shifted my attention back to my father. I reached out and picked up the 20% equity contract Jeremiah had slammed down moments earlier. The thick legal paper felt heavy in my hands. I held it up so he could see it clearly. I told my father that he lost the right to invest in my future the night he bet against my survival. With a swift, fluid motion, I tore the legally binding contract clean down the middle. My mother gasped out loud, a sharp intake of breath as her hand flew to her chest. I ignored her, placing the two halves together and tearing them again, reducing my father's extortion attempt to worthless quarters. I held my hand over Bryce's crystal water glass and opened my fingers. The shredded pieces of paper splashed into the ice water. The fresh black ink immediately began to bleed into the clear liquid, ruining the pristine setting of their table. I straightened my posture, towering over them, and signaled my general manager. Julian had been hovering near the mahogany bar with two of my largest, most imposing security guards. The moment I raised my hand, they stepped forward in unison, their sheer physical presence casting long, intimidating shadows over the velvet booth. I kept my voice pleasant, projecting just enough for the surrounding tables of politicians, local celebrities, and food critics to hear every single word. I thanked my family for stopping by, but cheerfully informed them that Sable and Smoke maintained a strict zero-tolerance policy against solicitation, harassment, and trespassing. I turned to my security team and ordered them to escort these individuals out of my restaurant immediately and to ensure they never crossed the threshold again. My father stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the floor. He was practically vibrating with fury, his fists clenched at his sides. But Jeremiah was a businessman who relied on his public image. He looked at the two massive guards, then at the sea of wealthy Atlanta patrons, watching his humiliation unfold with rapt attention. He knew better than to cause a physical altercation. He snatched his jacket, his face a mask of pure thunder, and stepped out of the booth. My mother was absolutely mortified. For a woman who worshipped social standing and mega-church pedigree, this public expulsion was a fate worse than death. She tried to hide her face behind her designer clutch, keeping her head down as she was forced to march through the center aisle of the dining room. Whispers rippled through the crowd. People pointed. The self-proclaimed elite family of Atlanta was being paraded out the front door like common criminals. Bryce stumbled over his own feet, trying to keep up with the guards, leaving his fake eviction notice abandoned on the table next to his ruined water glass. Julian marched ahead, holding open the heavy double-glass doors that led out to the humid Atlanta street. As the security guards firmly ushered them onto the sidewalk, Aaliyah stopped. She dug her expensive heels into the entryway mat and refused to be pushed any further. She turned around to face me. Her perfectly manicured mask of the innocent victimized sister was completely gone. Her eyes were dark with a vicious, unhinged venom that I remembered all too well from our childhood. She glared at me across the bustling reception area, entirely indifferent to the audience of diners and staff watching her meltdown. She smiled, a sharp, predatory smile that twisted her beautiful features into something ugly. She raised her voice, ensuring her words carried over the jazz music and the chatter of my front-of-house staff. She told me to enjoy my pristine, perfect kitchen tonight. She promised me that the city health inspector would be walking through those exact doors at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning to shut my entire operation down. She let out a short, nasty laugh as the security guards finally shoved her backward onto the concrete. The heavy glass doors swung shut, cutting off the noise of the traffic, but her threat lingered in the lobby air, a clear declaration of war. Saturday morning arrived with a violent pounding on the front glass doors of Sable and Smoke. It was exactly 6 o'clock. I had been in the office for an hour reviewing the inventory logs and finalizing the prep sheets for the massive weekend dinner service. I walked through the quiet, dimly lit dining room, the faint smell of citrus floor cleaner lingering from the night crew. Standing on the other side of the glass was an older man with a thick gray mustache, a heavy clipboard pressed against his chest, and an expression of absolute bureaucratic authority. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the door open. He did not wait for a greeting. He shoved his city identification badge directly into my line of sight and introduced himself as Inspector Harrison from the Department of Public Health. He informed me that he was conducting an immediate, unannounced inspection of the premises. I stepped back and gestured for him to enter my face, betraying absolutely no emotion. I knew exactly who had sent him. Aaliyah had not been making an empty threat the night before. Harrison marched past me, his boots clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He began reading aloud from his clipboard, his voice echoing in the empty restaurant. He stated that his office had received an urgent anonymous tip late last night. The caller had reported catastrophic health code violations, including raw meat stored at unsafe temperatures, backed up grease traps, and a severe rat infestation in the dry storage area. He looked up from his papers, his eyes narrowing as he assessed me. He warned me that if he found even a fraction of what was reported, he had the authority to padlock my doors and revoke my operating license on the spot. I calmly asked him to follow me. I pushed open the double swinging doors that led into the heart of my kitchen and flipped the main breaker switch. A dozen high-intensity fluorescent panels hummed to life, flooding the massive space with brilliant, unforgiving white light. I stood aside and invited him to look wherever he pleased. The kitchen was a fortress of gleaming, immaculate stainless steel. The floors were spotless, scrubbed and sanitized mere hours ago. The cutting boards were bleached, the ranges were polished, and the ventilation hoods were completely free of residue. I walked him to the walk-in refrigerators and opened the heavy metal doors. Every single container was perfectly labeled, dated, and stacked with mathematical precision. The temperature displays glowed a steady, safe 34 degrees. Inspector Harrison blinked, clearly disoriented. He walked down the center aisle, shining a heavy-duty flashlight under the prep tables and behind the industrial fryers. He found nothing but pristine tile and clean baseboards. He checked the dry storage room, inspecting the corners and the shelving units for any sign of rodents. There was absolutely nothing. He lowered his flashlight, looking down at his clipboard with a deep frown. He muttered that this made no sense. He read further down his notes and sighed, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and pity. He told me that the anonymous caller had been highly specific. The tipster had claimed that the owner of the establishment was mentally unstable, deeply indebted to illegal lenders, and running a fraudulent, unsanitary operation out of pure desperation. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure my words carried the sharp, undeniable edge of truth. I told Harrison that the anonymous caller was my younger sister, Aaliyah. I watched his eyebrows shoot up in surprise, but I did not stop. I explained that 3 years ago, Aaliyah had spectacularly failed her medical board exams for the second time. Instead of telling her to study harder, my parents rewarded her failure by financing a $150,000 spiritual wellness retreat in Sedona so she could find herself. I told the inspector that I, on the other hand, had spent 5 years working 80-hour weeks in commercial kitchens to save every dime I had. When I finally went to a bank and secured a legitimate, tightly regulated business loan to open this restaurant, my family sat around a dining table and formally declared me mentally unstable. I walked over to the nearest prep station and ran my bare hand across the gleaming metal surface, holding it up to show him there was not a single speck of dust. I told Harrison that my family labeled ambition as instability whenever it did not serve their immediate interests. I explained that they had barged into my dining room the night before, demanding 20% of my equity for free, and when I threw them out, my sister decided to weaponize the city health department for revenge. I asked him if he needed to check the grease traps again, or if he had seen enough of my illegal operation. Inspector Harrison was a man who had seen every trick and scam in the restaurant industry. He knew the difference between a negligent kitchen and a malicious phone call. He closed his clipboard and clipped his pen to the top. His stern demeanor melted into an expression of genuine professional respect. He looked around the immaculate kitchen one last time and told me that this was one of the cleanest, most well-managed facilities he had inspected in his 20-year career. He formally apologized for the intrusion, stating that the city took all tips seriously, but it was abundantly clear this was a case of targeted harassment. He promised to make a note in my permanent file regarding the false report to protect me from any future malicious calls. He shook my hand, wished me a successful weekend, and let himself out the back door into the early morning light. I stood alone in the bright kitchen, letting out a slow, steady breath. I had neutralized Aaliyah's sabotage before the sun was even fully up. I felt a surge of triumph, a confirmation that their petty, underhanded tactics could not penetrate the walls of the empire I had built. I turned toward the office to finish my prep lists, ready to tackle the Saturday service with a clear mind. But the quiet victory did not even last 5 minutes. The heavy metal door connecting the kitchen to the back alley loading dock suddenly burst open. It hit the wall with a deafening crash. Mateo, my head prep chef, stumbled into the kitchen. He was usually the calmest person on my staff, a man who could effortlessly break down 50 pounds of fish without breaking a sweat. But right now, he was panting heavily, his eyes wide with sheer panic. He gripped the edge of the nearest counter, struggling to catch his breath. I rushed over, asking him what was wrong. Mateo looked up at me, his face pale, and delivered a sentence that instantly brought my entire operation to a grinding halt. He told me that he had just checked the alley and called the dispatchers. Our local farmers, our meat purveyors, and our specialty produce vendors were all stranded. The Saturday delivery trucks were not coming. I rushed past Mateo, the heavy rubber soles of my work shoes slapping against the concrete as I pushed through the heavy steel doors leading to the back alley. The morning air was already thick with the oppressive heat of an Atlanta summer, but a cold knot of dread formed instantly in my stomach. The loading dock should have been a symphony of controlled chaos by now. It should have been loud with the sounds of reversing trucks, the shouting of local farmers, and the rhythmic clattering of hand trucks rolling over the pavement. Instead, the alley was completely silent and entirely empty. I walked to the edge of the dock and looked down the narrow access road. A heavy chain-link barricade had been stretched across the entrance, padlocked shut. Fastened to the center of the metal mesh was a bright orange municipal notice stamped with the unmistakable corporate logo of Bryce's commercial real estate firm. Mateo stumbled out behind me, clutching his inventory clipboard to his chest like a shield. He was hyperventilating, his words tumbling over each other as he explained the full extent of the disaster. Our commercial waste management company had called the front desk just 5 minutes before the health inspector left. Bryce had used his executive credentials to file an emergency suspension of our service access, claiming a sudden structural hazard in the alleyway. The property management firm had effectively frozen our garbage pickup and blocked our delivery route in one swift, bureaucratic stroke. I stared at the industrial dumpsters sitting at the far end of the dock. In a high-volume fine dining restaurant, waste removal is a matter of survival. Without it, a kitchen rapidly suffocates. And without fresh ingredients, a Saturday night dinner service with 300 expectant high-paying guests is an absolute impossibility. My local farmers carrying crates of fresh-caught snapper heirloom produce and prime cuts of meat were stranded somewhere on the other side of that locked fence. Bryce had weaponized his corporate title to enact a logistical siege. He knew the health inspector would find an immaculate kitchen, so he decided to starve Sable and Smoke from the outside. I reached into the pocket of my chef trousers to pull out my phone, desperate to call my vendors and coordinate a manual drop-off at the front entrance, regardless of how chaotic it would look. But before I could dial a single number, the screen illuminated with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I let the phone vibrate in my palm, the device buzzing against my skin like an angry hornet. I clenched my jaw so tightly that a sharp pain shot up through my temples. After the 4th ring, I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I just stood in the suffocating heat of the empty alleyway and waited. Jeremiah's voice boomed through the speaker, dripping with a thick, syrupy layer of false paternal concern. He asked how my Saturday morning was going, his tone casually masking the venom underneath. He mentioned that he had heard a troubling rumor about some severe logistical blockades down in my commercial district. He let out a heavy, theatrical sigh, stating that it was a terrible shame how unreliable independent vendors and city services could be. He said it was tragic how easily a small, vulnerable business could be brought to its knees by a single hiccup in the supply chain. I listened to the smooth, calculated cadence of his voice, feeling a deep, familiar wave of revulsion wash over me. This was his signature strategy, the exact psychological warfare he had used to build his own empire. He manufactured a devastating crisis through his proxies, and then positioned himself as the benevolent, powerful savior. My father dropped the sympathetic act entirely, his voice shifting into the hard, uncompromising tone he used in boardrooms to crush his competitors. He told me that his logistics company had a fleet of refrigerated transport trucks sitting idle at a depot just 10 miles north of the city. He offered to dispatch a specialized team immediately. He promised me that his trucks possessed the corporate clearance to bypass the property management barricade. He swore his men could pick up my stranded farmers, transport my inventory directly to the kitchen, and handle all of my waste removal before the noon prep shift even began. He guaranteed that my critical Saturday night dinner service would execute flawlessly without a single guest ever knowing there had been a problem. There was a heavy pause on the line before he delivered the catch. He told me that all I had to do was send my general manager over to his corporate headquarters with the signed 20% equity contract. He framed it as a standard partnership, a loving father providing vital infrastructure to help his struggling daughter succeed. He told me that my independence was a dangerous myth, and that I needed his power to survive the harsh reality of the business world. I stood motionless on the loading dock, looking at the bright orange padlock on the chain-link fence. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent perfecting my craft, the burns on my arms, and the sheer grit it took to secure a bank loan while my family labeled me unstable. I gripped the phone, my knuckles turning stark white under the pressure. I kept my voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of any anger or panic. I told my father that his infrastructure was nothing but a choke chain, and I would gladly burn my entire restaurant to the ground before I ever let him hold the leash. Jeremiah exploded. He started shouting through the speaker, his voice rising in volume and rage, warning me that I was making a fatal, bankrupting mistake. I did not let him finish his threat. I pulled the phone away from my ear and hit the red button, cutting him off mid-sentence. I turned to Mateo, who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes paralyzed by the looming disaster. I ordered him to get back inside, rally the prep team, and start breaking down whatever inventory we had left in the walk-in coolers. I turned my back on the empty, barricaded alley and walked briskly through the bustling stainless steel kitchen, ignoring the questioning looks of my kitchen staff. I headed straight for my private office at the end of the hall, stepping inside and locking the heavy wooden door behind me. I walked directly over to the tall mahogany bookshelf, shifted a heavy stack of vintage culinary encyclopedias, and revealed the steel dial of a hidden wall safe. I spun the dial, punching in the combination with rapid, precise movements. The heavy metal door clicked and swung open. I reached past the stacks of emergency petty cash and the thick folders of business insurance policies reaching all the way to the back. I pulled out the two items I had kept hidden for exactly a moment like this. I placed a cheap prepaid burner phone and a thick, heavily worn black ledger onto my desk. I opened the thick black ledger, its worn leather binding familiar and comforting under my fingertips. Inside these pages was not my standard publicly registered list of corporate vendors. This was my shadow network. Over the past 6 years, I had cultivated relationships with independent growers, private importers, and off-grid purveyors who dealt exclusively in cash and operated entirely outside the bureaucratic reach of the commercial real estate firms my father influenced. I picked up the prepaid burner phone and dialed a number I had memorized long ago. Elias answered on the second ring. He was a broker for a coalition of regional organic farms and private butchers, a man who moved premium product with absolute discretion and staggering speed. I kept my voice brisk and professional. I told him I needed a full weekend inventory replacement, top-tier quality delivered in exactly 45 minutes. I read off the required quantities from Mateo's prep sheet, listing the pounds of fresh snapper, the crates of heirloom tomatoes, and the specific cuts of dry, aged beef. Elias did not ask questions. He did not hesitate. He simply quoted me a premium price, confirmed the delivery coordinates, and hung up the phone. I stepped back out into the kitchen. Mateo and the prep crew were standing around the stainless steel tables, their faces etched with defeat. The ambient hum of the refrigerators felt mocking in the face of our empty shelves. I clapped my hands sharply, the sound cutting through the heavy silence like a whip. I ordered them back to their stations, instructing them to heat the ranges, sharpen their knives, and prep the line. I told them the product was on its way. Mateo looked at me skeptically, gesturing weakly toward the back door, reminding me that the property management gate was still padlocked shut by Bryce's corporate order. I smiled, feeling a cold surge of satisfaction. I informed my head chef that Bryce had only locked the primary commercial access road. He had completely overlooked the narrow, privately owned service easement running behind the adjacent abandoned textile building. It was an easement I had quietly purchased the rights to use 2 years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. I told Mateo to grab the hand trucks and meet me at the secondary loading bay. Less than an hour later, the low, steady rumble of heavy diesel engines echoed through the back hallway. I pushed open the secondary service doors. 3 unmarked matte black utility vans reversed smoothly through the private easement, bypassing Bryce's bright orange barricade by a mere 50 feet. The drivers killed the engines and jumped out, throwing open the rear doors. Inside were pristine, ice-packed coolers of wild-caught seafood, perfectly marbled cuts of prime beef, and crates of vibrant farm-fresh produce. Mateo's jaw dropped. The sheer volume and quality of the product was staggering. I patted him on the shoulder and told him to start unloading. The kitchen immediately erupted into a frenzy of coordinated high-speed action. Knives flashed against cutting boards, pans sizzled with hot oil, and the heavy atmosphere of dread evaporated. It was replaced by the intense, focused energy of a world-class culinary team preparing for battle. My staff moved with a synchronized rhythm, breaking down the massive delivery and stocking the line in record time. The Saturday night dinner service at Sable and Smoke was nothing short of legendary. When the front doors opened at exactly 5 o'clock, the dining room flooded with our reservations. The ambient jazz music swelled, mingling with the low hum of expensive conversations and the clinking of crystal wine glasses. I stood at the pass, inspecting every single plate before it left the kitchen. The seared scallops were perfectly crusted and resting on a bed of sweet corn puree. The dry-aged ribeyes were cooked to a flawless medium, rare, dripping with compound butter. The vibrant garnishes popped against the dark ceramic plating. We did not miss a single beat. We did not drop a single ticket. We executed a flawless 300-cover service right under the noses of the family who had tried to starve us out. By midnight, the last of the guests had departed, leaving behind a trail of generous tips and glowing compliments. The kitchen crew began their breakdown routines, scrubbing the line and sweeping the floors with the exhausted satisfaction of a hard-won victory. I retreated to my private office, the heavy wooden door shutting out the ambient noise of the restaurant. I sat down at my desk, the adrenaline slowly draining from my system, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I looked at the burner phone resting on the mahogany wood. Tonight was a triumph, but it was purely defensive. I had survived their attack, but survival was no longer enough. Jeremiah and Bryce had shown their hand. They were perfectly willing to destroy my reputation, sabotage my supply chain, and leverage my livelihood just to force me into submission. They believed that because they had wealth and corporate influence, they could simply wear me down through a war of attrition. They thought I would eventually tire of dodging their landmines and surrender my equity just to make the harassment stop. They were entirely wrong. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the shadows playing across the ceiling. Playing defense meant I was still letting them dictate the terms of the game. It meant waiting for Aaliyah to call the health department again, or waiting for Bryce to find another obscure zoning loophole, or waiting for my father to buy out my alternative suppliers. I could not run a multi-million-dollar culinary empire while constantly checking over my shoulder for my family's next knife strike. If I wanted absolute peace, I had to completely dismantle their ability to wage war. I had to hit them where it actually mattered. I had to strip away the one thing that gave them their arrogance, their power, and their sense of untouchable superiority. I had to systematically dismantle their wealth. I picked up the burner phone, my fingers flying across the keypad. I opened an encrypted messaging application and selected a contact saved only under a single initial. My private investigator had been relentlessly digging into my father's corporate holdings, Bryce's real estate transactions, and Aaliyah's lavish debt-fueled spending habits for the past 8 months. I had originally asked him to find the cracks in their foundation just as an insurance policy. I wanted to map out the hidden debts, the over-leveraged assets, and the quiet financial vulnerabilities they kept desperately hidden from their high society friends. I stared at the blank text field, my thumb hovering over the screen. The trap I had meticulously laid out over the past year was finally primed. By orchestrating this coordinated attack on my business, they had crossed the final line, proving they would stop at nothing to ruin me. Now the gloves were fully off. I typed out a single definitive message and hit send. They took the bait. Initiate phase 2 of the asset transfer. I want everything they owe. Sunday morning in a high-volume restaurant usually carries a specific kind of bruised tranquility. The chaotic energy of the Saturday night dinner rush has evaporated, leaving behind the quiet hum of industrial refrigerators and the faint scent of roasted garlic and floor sanitizer. I sat at the mahogany desk in my private office, watching the first light of dawn creep through the blinds. The thick black ledger remained open in front of me, a physical testament to the counteroffensive I had just launched. Phase 2 was already in motion. My private investigator had received the green light, and the slow, methodical dismantling of my family's hidden financial structure had begun. I took a sip of black coffee, finally allowing my shoulders to drop. I had survived my father's logistical siege and my brother-in-law's legal extortion. I assumed I had bought myself at least a few days of peace before their next desperate maneuver. I was entirely wrong. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy wooden door to my office swung open. Julian, my general manager, stood in the doorway. He was a man who handled VIP meltdowns, kitchen fires, and double-booked tables with unflappable grace. But right now his face was drawn, and his posture was rigid with anxiety. He did not say a word. He simply walked over to my desk and placed the restaurant's master reservation tablet directly over my open ledger. The screen was a sea of flashing red alerts. I leaned forward, my brow furrowing as I scrolled through the system. Cancellations. Dozens of them. They were not just standard 2-top reservations dropping out because of a change in weekend plans. These were our premium bookings. The 40-person private dining room buyout for a corporate luncheon was gone. The 20-person anniversary dinner in the wine cellar was canceled. A massive charity gala pre-dinner reception scheduled for next Friday had been wiped from the calendar. I watched the screen as another red notification popped up in real time, canceling a table of 6 for that very evening. In the span of a few hours, we had hemorrhaged nearly 30% of our projected revenue for the entire month. I looked up at Julian and asked him what exactly was happening. Julian ran a hand over his face, looking deeply uncomfortable. He explained that the host stand had been fielding calls since 8 in the morning. The guests were not just canceling, they were hostile. He told me that his receptionists were being subjected to aggressive lectures before the callers slammed the phone down. I demanded to know what the callers were saying. Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second before delivering the reality. He told me that every single cancellation was citing grave moral concerns. According to the people calling in, a vicious rumor was circulating that Sable and Smoke was not a legitimate culinary establishment. The whisper on the street was that my restaurant was a sophisticated front for money laundering, financed entirely by illicit funds, and illegal syndicate operations. I stared at the glowing red screen, the pieces rapidly snapping into place. I asked Julian to pull up the guest profiles of the canceled parties. He tapped the screen, filtering the data. I read the names: the deacon board chairman, the senior pastor's sister-in-law, the head of the women's ministry, the leading donors, and the elite socialites. Every single canceled reservation belonged to the upper echelon of Covenant Fellowship, the sprawling arena-sized megachurch that my family attended. It was Vivian. My father wielded contracts and trucking fleets. Bryce wielded corporate loopholes and municipal threats. But my mother's domain had always been social currency. Vivian was the undisputed queen of the megachurch's elite hierarchy. She did not need to forge an eviction notice or barricade an alleyway. She simply had to plant a toxic seed disguised as a prayer request. I could perfectly picture her standing in the opulent church foyer, wearing her Sunday best, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. I knew exactly how she had framed it. She had gathered her wealthy, influential prayer circle and tearfully asked them to pray for her wayward daughter Zora, who had fallen into a dark, illegal crowd. She had weaponized their faith and their gossip to strip my restaurant of its most lucrative demographic. She was trying to bankrupt me by making me a social pariah in Atlanta. Before I could even formulate a response to Julian, my personal cell phone buzzed violently against the desk. The screen lit up with a new text message. It was from my mother. I picked up the device, my eyes tracking over the glowing words. "The Lord exposes all frauds. Come home and apologize to your father." I read the text twice, letting the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of her words sink into my bones. Vivian had watched my father kick me out of their house into the freezing rain 6 years ago because I wanted to be a chef. She had sat in my dining booth on Friday night sipping sparkling water while her son-in-law tried to extort 20% of my business. She had silently approved of Aaliyah attempting to trigger a fraudulent health department raid. And now, having failed at brute force, she was hiding behind her religion, demanding my submission and an apology for surviving their attacks. Julian stood silently, waiting for instructions. He asked if he should draft a public relations statement or reach out to the clients individually to combat the rumors. I set the phone down. I told Julian to leave the reservation book exactly as it was. I instructed him to alert the kitchen that we would be running a leaner service tonight, but to keep morale high. I assured him that I was going to handle the public relations issue personally. Julian nodded, though he looked uncertain, and stepped out of the office, pulling the door shut behind him. I stood up from my desk. The cold, sharp clarity that had settled over me the night before returned with a renewed, piercing intensity. My family had continuously escalated the warfare, moving from my lease to my supply chain, and now to my reputation. They truly believed that if they squeezed hard enough, I would break. They thought my absence from their circles meant I was afraid to face them on their own territory. I walked over to the private wardrobe tucked into the corner of my office suite. I pushed the sliding doors aside, bypassing my usual chef coats and comfortable kitchenware. I reached into the back and pulled out a bespoke, razor-sharp crimson designer suit. It was a piece I had commissioned months ago for a major culinary award ceremony, an outfit designed to command absolute authority in any room. I had not stepped foot inside the sprawling campus of Covenant Fellowship in 6 long years. I had sworn I would never return to the place where my family paraded their false righteousness while treating me like a disposable disappointment. But defending my restaurant from behind a desk was no longer an option. Vivian wanted to use her congregation as a weapon against my livelihood. She wanted me to come home and apologize. I quickly changed into the suit, the tailored fabric feeling like armor against my skin. I secured my hair, adjusted the sharp lapels, and slipped on a pair of immaculate stilettos. I picked up my car keys, the metal cool and heavy in my palm. I was not going to send a press release to combat her whispers. I was going to address the congregation directly. It was time for Sunday service. The sprawling campus of Covenant Fellowship stretched across 50 acres of meticulously manicured Georgian landscape. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open the doors of luxury sedans and European sports cars, ushering the city's elite toward the massive sanctuary. I pulled my vehicle into a spot near the main entrance, killed the engine, and stepped out into the humid morning air. My bespoke crimson suit was a sharp, aggressive slash of color against the sea of pastel florals, modest creams and muted seersucker favored by the Sunday morning high society. I had not set foot on these grounds since the day my father told me my culinary ambitions were a disgrace to the family name and ordered me to pack my bags. Today, I was returning not as a prodigal daughter seeking forgiveness, but as a conqueror reclaiming her territory. The massive glass double doors slid open automatically, and I stepped into the grand vestibule. Pre-sermon mingling was at its absolute peak. Thousands of congregants buzzed in the cavernous sunlit space, creating a symphony of polite laughter and strategic networking that masqueraded as holy fellowship. I ignored the welcoming committee, bypassing the greeters holding out glossy programs, and pushed straight through the heavy oak doors, leading directly into the main sanctuary. My stilettos struck the polished marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic click that echoed up into the vaulted ceilings. I walked straight down the center aisle. Heads immediately began to turn. The low, comfortable hum of conversation faltered, dropping into a sudden localized silence that rippled outward like a wave as congregants recognized the woman in the red suit. Whispers flared up in my wake, undoubtedly fueled by the vicious rumors my mother had spent the last 48 hours actively seeding. I kept my gaze fixed forward, my shoulders back, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. In the third row, the undisputed domain of the megachurch's wealthiest tier, my mother noticed the sudden shift in the room's energy. Vivian turned her perfectly coiffed hair, catching the bright sanctuary lights. For a fraction of a second, genuine, unadulterated shock widened her eyes. I was supposed to be a ruined woman weeping in my office, financially suffocated and preparing a tearful surrender. Instead, I was marching down her aisle looking like $1,000,000 radiating power. Her shock instantly morphed into desperate, calculated damage control. Vivian quickly excused herself from her circle of wealthy prayer warriors and stepped directly into the center aisle to block my path. She wore a tight, brittle smile, her hands extended as if to welcome her lost child, though her eyes were frantic with a silent, furious warning. She leaned in, her posture rigid, preparing to whisper a harsh command to turn around and step outside before I caused a scene. I did not slow my pace. I did not offer a greeting. As Vivian reached out to grab my arm, I simply sidestepped her with smooth, practiced agility. I brushed past her shoulder without breaking stride, leaving her standing entirely empty-handed and foolish in the exact center of the aisle. A collective audible gasp rose from her nearby prayer circle. Vivian's absolute authority over her social domain had just been publicly, effortlessly dismissed by her own daughter. I continued my march straight to the foot of the altar. Pastor Thomas and First Lady Sarah were holding court near the grand piano, greeting the highest tithing members of the congregation. I stepped right into their exclusive circle, projecting my voice so it carried clearly to the first 5 rows, where my mother and her influential friends were sitting in stunned silence. I offered a bright, charismatic smile and greeted the pastor warmly. He looked momentarily caught off guard, undoubtedly aware of the money-laundering rumors my mother had been actively spreading through his flock. I did not give him a chance to speak or question my presence. I reached into the breast pocket of my crimson blazer and withdrew a crisp cashier's check. I announced, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity, that God had blessed my restaurant Sable and Smoke with unprecedented and overwhelming success. I stated that it was only right to return a portion of that massive financial blessing to the community that had raised me. I handed the heavy paper directly to Pastor Thomas. I told him it was a $50,000 donation earmarked specifically for the new youth outreach center his wife had been passionately championing for months. The pastor's eyes widened comically as he looked at the amount printed on the check. The hesitation vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a glowing, opportunistic joy. $50,000 of cleared, verified funds had a miraculous way of erasing unsubstantiated gossip. Before the shock could fully settle over the front pews, I delivered the final devastating blow to my mother's whisper campaign. I turned to First Lady Sarah, who organized the church's legendary annual charity gala. I loudly offered to have my entire culinary team cater the upcoming 500-guest event absolutely free of charge. I promised her a bespoke 5-course menu that would rival any Michelin-starred establishment in the country. I framed it as a humble, heartfelt offering of service from a successful local business wanting to give back to the congregation. Pastor Thomas let out a booming laugh of sheer delight. He stepped forward and pulled me into a massive, highly visible embrace, loudly proclaiming his profound gratitude for my extraordinary generosity and faithful spirit. First Lady Sarah clasped my hands, gushing about the proposed menu and profusely thanking me for saving their gala budget. The message was instantly broadcast to every watching eye in the sanctuary. You do not embrace a money launderer. You do not let a criminal syndicate cater the biggest, most prestigious social event of the church calendar. With a single check and a catering offer, I had purchased the absolute unshakable endorsement of the church leadership. Vivian's vicious rumors were instantly rendered entirely obsolete. I glanced back at the third row. My mother had sunk back into her pew, her face a rigid mask of profound public humiliation. Her elite friends were already leaning away from her, whispering rapidly among themselves, looking at her with thinly veiled suspicion. I had completely neutralized her power in her own sanctuary, flipping her social weapon back onto her. I excused myself gracefully, citing the heavy demands of running my restaurant, and turned to walk back down the center aisle. The congregants actually parted for me, offering respectful nods and awed murmurs. The rumored pariah had just become the congregation's premier benefactor. I pushed through the heavy oak doors, stepping out of the sanctuary and crossing the grand vestibule toward the main exit. The morning sun hit my face as I walked through the glass doors toward the parking lot. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph coursing through my veins. I had beaten them on the loading dock, and I had crushed them in the pews. But before I could reach into my pocket for my car keys, a heavy vice-like grip clamped down brutally on my upper arm. The force of it yanked me backward, nearly throwing me off balance. I whipped my head around. Jeremiah's face was inches from mine, his features contorted with a terrifying, barely contained rage. He did not say a word. He just tightened his crushing grip on my arm and began dragging me forcefully toward the secluded edge of the VIP parking lot. The Georgia heat hit me like a physical wall the moment my father shoved me through the heavy glass doors of the church vestibule. His grip on my upper arm was excruciating, his thick fingers digging into the expensive fabric of my crimson suit. I did not scream. I did not fight his momentum. I allowed him to pull me past the bewildered valet attendants and down the concrete steps toward the VIP parking lot. I kept my face entirely impassive, refusing to give the watching congregants the satisfaction of a public scuffle. I simply matched his frantic pace, my stilettos clicking sharply against the sun-baked asphalt until we reached the secluded corridor of pavement sandwiched between his custom Mercedes and a towering black SUV. The moment we were out of direct sight, Jeremiah spun around and slammed his free hand against the hood of his car. The booming metallic echo rang through the empty lot. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and realized the legendary patriarch of the Wilson family was unraveling right in front of my eyes. The smooth, imposing corporate titan who had terrorized me for decades was completely gone. In his place stood a frantic, sweating older man. Dark patches of moisture stained the underarms of his custom-tailored dress shirt. A visible tremor shook his shoulders, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and darting wildly. He did not attempt to charm me. He abandoned his usual manipulative baritone and launched directly into a tirade. His voice cracked as he demanded the 20% equity contract for Sable and Smoke. He was no longer pitching a strategic business partnership or pretending to be a benevolent father offering logistical infrastructure. He was demanding my restaurant the way a drowning man demands a life preserver. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, stepping so close I could smell the stale coffee and bitter peppermint on his breath. He screamed that I had no idea what I was doing, that my little stunt inside the sanctuary had just ruined everything. He told me I owed him my life, my talent, and my success. He swore that if I did not have the signed equity papers delivered to his corporate headquarters by Monday morning, he would utterly obliterate my existence. He threatened to call the state liquor commission and have my licenses permanently revoked. He threatened to leverage his banking connections to call in the remainder of my small business loans. He promised to salt the earth around Sable and Smoke so thoroughly that I would be scrubbing pots in a roadside diner by the end of the year. I stared at his trembling hand. I looked at the beads of sweat dripping down his temples. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. I looked down at the hand still gripping my bicep. With a sudden explosive rotation of my shoulder and a rigid upward strike of my forearm, I broke his hold. The physical shock of the maneuver sent him stumbling backward. He hit the side of his car, his chest heaving as he stared at me in disbelief. I smoothly adjusted the lapel of my crimson blazer, brushing a speck of invisible dust from my sleeve. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper. I told him that his intimidation tactics stopped working on me the exact day I turned 22. I reminded him that I had walked out of his house with nothing but my knives and the clothes on my back, and I had built a multi-million-dollar culinary empire while he and Vivian prayed for my failure. I stepped forward, forcing him to press his back flat against his car. I told him he was not a god, he was not a king, and I was absolutely not his sacrificial lamb. I informed him that if he ever touched me again, I would have my security team break his jaw before the police even arrived. Jeremiah opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just stood there, breathing heavily, completely stripped of his power. I turned on my heel and walked away. I did not look back. I strode across the burning asphalt toward my own vehicle. Behind me, Jeremiah finally found his voice. He started screaming my name, his shouts echoing off the surrounding concrete, cursing my restaurant and my arrogance. His voice sounded remarkably small. I unlocked my car, slid into the cool leather driver's seat, and pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life, drowning out his empty threats. I shifted into gear and drove out of the megachurch parking lot, leaving my father standing alone in the suffocating heat. I merged onto the interstate, the adrenaline slowly leveling out into a deep, focused calm. I had publicly humiliated Vivian and physically stood down Jeremiah. The opening moves of Phase 2 were executed flawlessly. As I cruised down the center lane, the dashboard display screen of my car chimed with an incoming notification. It was an encrypted alert from my private investigator. I tapped the steering wheel control to open the message. A secure PDF file began downloading directly to my phone. I took the next exit, pulling into the shaded corner of a quiet strip mall parking lot to read the contents safely. I opened the file. It was the complete, unredacted financial dossier on my sister Aaliyah and her husband Bryce. My investigator had bypassed their sanitized public tax returns and dug straight into their offshore holding companies and private trust accounts. I scrolled through the first few pages, analyzing the spreadsheets. Bryce and Aaliyah were entirely bankrupt. Their luxurious lifestyle was funded by a terrifying mountain of hidden corporate debt and severely overleveraged real estate portfolios. But as I swiped to the final section of the dossier, my breath caught in my throat. The accounts were not just bleeding money into luxury cars and designer clothes. Bryce had been quietly shuffling massive illegal wire transfers through his real estate firm directly into the accounts of Jeremiah's primary logistics company. I zoomed in on the balance sheets, my eyes tracking the devastating numbers. The puzzle pieces locked together with horrifying clarity. My father's legendary shipping and logistics empire was not expanding. It was not dominating the eastern seaboard. It was collapsing under the weight of catastrophic debt. Jeremiah was quietly hemorrhaging millions of dollars, and he was using Bryce to illegally funnel money to cover his failing margins. My father did not want 20% of Sable and Smoke because he was greedy. He was demanding my restaurant because my clean, highly profitable, cash-rich business was the only asset left that could save his sinking ship. He was bleeding out, and he needed my lifeblood to survive. I locked my phone, a predatory smile slowly spreading across my face. They were already dead. They just did not know it yet. The morning light sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sable and Smoke, casting long, geometric shadows across the empty dining room. Monday mornings were typically my sanctuary. The kitchen was already humming with the low, rhythmic sounds of the early prep team, simmering veal bones for the demi-glace and chopping mirepoix. but the front of house remained perfectly still. I sat at a corner booth, a cup of black coffee cooling beside my tablet. The screen displayed the damning financial dossier my private investigator had sent the day before. The numbers were absolute poetry. My father's logistics empire was a hollow shell, and Bryce's real estate firm was the illegal siphon desperately trying to keep it afloat. I swiped through the pages of fraudulent wire transfers, marveling at their sheer arrogant stupidity. The heavy brass handle of the front entrance rattled, breaking the quiet. The door pushed open, letting in a rush of warm Atlanta air. I looked up, expecting the morning delivery from my linen supplier. It was Aaliyah. My younger sister stood in the entryway looking entirely out of place in my restaurant. She was normally a walking editorial for high society perfection, dripping in diamonds and aggressively tailored couture. Today, however, she had carefully curated a completely different aesthetic. She wore oversized dark sunglasses that covered half her face, a beige cashmere wrap clutched tightly around her shoulders, and minimal makeup. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot. She was playing the role of the exhausted, battered peacemaker, and she was playing it to the hilt. I locked my tablet, sliding it face down on the polished mahogany table. I did not stand up to greet her. I simply watched her navigate the maze of empty tables, her expensive flats clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She slid into the booth across from me, removing her sunglasses with a trembling hand. Her eyes were red-rimmed, artificially manufactured to look as though she had spent the entire night weeping. She reached across the table, attempting to cover my hand with hers. I slowly withdrew my hand, wrapping my fingers around my coffee mug. Aaliyah let out a heavy, shuddering sigh. She launched directly into her rehearsed monologue, her voice thick with manufactured sorrow. She told me she was absolutely mortified by the events of the weekend. She claimed she had been completely blindsided by the barricade in the alleyway. She swore she had begged Bryce to remove the padlock the moment she found out. She framed her husband not as a malicious extortionist, but as an overly aggressive, hyper-masculine alpha male who simply saw a liability on his property and overreacted without consulting her. She did not stop there. She smoothly pivoted to our father. Aaliyah leaned in close, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a deeply guarded state secret. She told me Jeremiah was not in his right mind. She painted a picture of an aging patriarch buckling under the immense pressure of global supply chain disruptions and harsh macroeconomic realities. She excused his parking lot ambush as the desperate panic of an exhausted man. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, asking me to find it in my heart, to forgive them for their trespasses, because underneath it all, we were still blood. I sat perfectly still, letting her spin her intricate web of absolute garbage. I knew exactly what was on the tablet resting inches from her fingertips. I knew Bryce had not acted out of caution. He had acted out of pure, calculated malice to force me to surrender equity. I knew my father was not stressed by the global economy. He was suffocating under the weight of his own illegal debt. But I did not interrupt her. I let her play her hand. Then came the pivot. Aaliyah dropped her gaze to the table, biting her lower lip. She told me that the family tension was tearing her apart, but there was a more immediate crisis. She took a deep breath and asked me for a bridge. She classified it as a temporary quiet sister-to-sister loan. She needed $500,000 in liquid cash transferred by the end of the business day. She explained the request with a flawless practiced lie. She claimed it was just a minor shipping misstep. A massive container of luxury imported goods had been delayed at customs due to an administrative error, and she needed the cash to satisfy a highly demanding international vendor until the insurance claim cleared. She swore she would pay me back with exorbitant interest in exactly 30 days. She squeezed her eyes shut, letting a single perfect tear roll down her cheek. She begged me to keep this strictly between us, promising to keep Vivian and Jeremiah entirely out of the loop. She claimed our parents would be devastated to know she had mismanaged a vendor contract, and she was coming to me because I was the only successful independent businesswoman she could truly trust. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to laugh directly in her face. The $500,000 was not for a delayed shipping container. It was a frantic patch to cover the gaping hole in my father's logistics payroll, a hole Bryce could no longer fill with his illegal wire transfers because my investigator was already tracking them. Aaliyah was trying to use my own money to save the very men who had tried to destroy me 48 hours ago. I softened my facial expression. I unclasped my hands from my coffee mug and reached across the table, gently placing my fingers over hers. I mirrored her tone, injecting my voice with a deep sisterly empathy. I told her how incredibly brave it was for her to come to me. I validated her stress, murmuring softly about how difficult it must be to manage a household with Bryce's aggressive personality and our father's looming expectations. I watched relief wash over her face. She truly believed her performance had worked. She thought she had successfully manipulated the estranged, bitter older sister by tossing me a few crumbs of familial validation. I squeezed her hand gently and told her I absolutely wanted to help her out of this temporary bind. I watched her eyes light up with pure greed. But then I smoothly introduced the catch. I explained that $500,000 in liquid capital was not petty cash. I told her that pulling that kind of money directly from Sable and Smoke's operating reserves would immediately trigger a massive red flag with my corporate accountants and my certified public accountant. I could not simply write a personal check for that amount without raising suspicion. I told her that if I was going to move the funds, I had to legally classify the transaction as a secured short-term corporate investment. Aaliyah frowned, the manufactured vulnerability slipping for a fraction of a second. She asked me what that meant. I kept my voice warm and entirely reasonable. I told her that in order to justify the cash pull to my financial team, I needed to perform a basic standard physical audit of the collateral. I told her I needed to take a comprehensive unrestricted tour of Jeremiah's main logistics warehouse facility before the end of the day. I framed it as a mere formality, a simple box to check for the accountants so I could release her funds by nightfall. Aaliyah hesitated. Her eyes darted rapidly as her mind calculated the risks. Giving me access to the central nervous system of my father's failing empire was dangerous. But the desperation for $500,000 of clean, untraceable cash was a blinding force. She needed the money to stop the bleeding, and she needed it today. She firmly believed I was just a naive chef who would not know what to look for in an industrial shipping depot. She squeezed my hand back, a bright, triumphant smile breaking through her fake tears. She agreed instantly. She promised to arrange the clearance and meet me at the facility gates at 3 o'clock sharp. She thanked me profusely, calling me her savior before sliding out of the booth and hurrying out of the restaurant to secure the arrangements. I watched the heavy glass door swing shut behind her. I picked up my tablet and unlocked the screen, staring at the catastrophic financial data detailing my father's ruin. The trap was locked. They were about to hand me the keys to their own destruction. The rusted iron gates of Wilson Global Logistics loomed at the end of the industrial parkway. I pulled my vehicle up to the security checkpoint at exactly 2:55. The guard booth, usually manned by 2 armed attendants, was completely empty. I pressed the buzzer. A full minute passed before the mechanical gate slowly ground open, protesting with a loud metallic shriek. I drove through the tires of my car, crunching over deeply cracked pavement that had not seen fresh asphalt in years. Aaliyah was waiting for me near Bay 4. She had swapped her cashmere wrap for a pristine, neon yellow reflective vest layered over a silk blouse. She held a branded clipboard against her chest, standing perfectly straight, attempting to project the image of a seasoned corporate director. It was a laughable costume. I stepped out of my car, locking it with a sharp beep. Aaliyah immediately launched into her rehearsed performance. She threw her arms wide, gesturing to the sprawling corrugated steel facility. She proudly announced that we were standing in a 200,000 square foot distribution hub, the absolute crown jewel of the Wilson Empire. She rattled off fabricated statistics with practiced ease, claiming they moved thousands of tons of commercial freight every single week and serviced elite corporate contracts across the eastern seaboard. I nodded politely, letting her walk me toward the massive loading bays. Growing up, I had begged my father to let me learn the family business. I had wanted to understand routing logistics, fleet management, and supply chain mechanics. Jeremiah had laughed in my face. He had explicitly told me that the shipping industry was a brutal masculine arena. He said women belonged in hospitality or administration, not on the loading dock. His archaic sexism was the exact reason I had poured my ambition into the culinary world. But running a highly successful multi-million-dollar restaurant requires a masterful understanding of supply chains. I knew exactly how a healthy, functioning logistics hub was supposed to look, sound, and smell. This facility was a graveyard. As Aaliyah led me past a line of 18-wheelers boasting about their recent fleet upgrades, I kept my eyes fixed on the details. The heavy commercial trucks were parked in perfectly straight lines, but a thick layer of industrial dust coated their windshields. I glanced down at the front bumpers. The Department of Transportation inspection stickers had expired 6 months ago. Dark, dried oil stains marked the concrete beneath the engines, proving these vehicles had been sitting idle for weeks. We walked into the main warehouse cavern. Aaliyah pointed to the soaring racks of palletized inventory, claiming they were operating at maximum capacity. I looked at the forklifts. Out of 12 machines, only 2 were operational. The others were parked in the maintenance corner, stripped of essential parts, heavily cannibalized to keep the remaining 2 running. The air inside the warehouse was stagnant. A thriving distribution center breathes. It hums with the constant roar of diesel engines, the backup sirens of reversing trucks, and the shouted orders of foremen. The Wilson facility was suffocatingly quiet. The echo of our footsteps bouncing off the high metal ceiling was the loudest sound in the building. I smiled warmly at Aaliyah, praising the sheer scale of the operation. She beamed, entirely convinced that her superficial tour was working. She clearly believed that a chef would only see big trucks and tall shelves, completely blind to the systemic decay eating the company alive. She steered me toward the administrative wing, eager to show off the newly renovated corporate break room. She pushed open the double doors, highlighting the stainless steel appliances and the espresso machines my father had installed to boost company morale. My eyes immediately drifted past the expensive coffee maker to the large corkboard mounted on the far wall. It was meant for federal labor law posters and birthday announcements. Instead, it was plastered with bright pink and yellow notices. I stepped closer, pretending to admire the granite countertops. The notices were formal union grievances. They detailed unpaid overtime, canceled health insurance premiums, and threats of an imminent organized strike. A separate sheet of paper pinned near the bottom was a final warning from the local utility company, threatening to sever power to the facility due to 90 days of non-payment. Aaliyah noticed my gaze shift. Panic flashed across her meticulously contoured face. She quickly stepped directly in front of the corkboard, physically blocking the union notices from my view. She offered a tight, brittle laugh, waving her hand dismissively. She claimed the union representatives were just being overly dramatic about a minor payroll glitch that had already been resolved. She grabbed my arm, attempting to guide me back out into the hallway, eager to conclude the tour and secure her check. I stopped walking. I planted my feet firmly on the linoleum floor, forcing her to halt. I dropped the sisterly facade and transitioned entirely into the persona of a ruthless corporate investor. I looked her dead in the eye and told her the facility was structurally impressive. I agreed that the physical footprint held immense potential. Then I let my voice drop an octave, stripping it of all warmth. I explained that my accounting team did not authorize $500,000 corporate transfers based on warehouse square footage and espresso machines. I told her that physical assets were meaningless without verified cash flow. I stated with absolute unyielding authority that before I wired a single cent to her vendor, I needed to see the main ledger. I needed to see the profit and loss statements, the accounts receivable, and the vendor debt schedule for the past 2 quarters. Aaliyah physically recoiled. The remaining color drained from her face. She stammered, her voice pitching an octave higher. She protested, reminding me that this was supposed to be a quiet sister-to-sister arrangement. She pleaded that opening the books was a gross violation of Jeremiah's privacy and completely unnecessary for a temporary bridge loan. I did not blink. I crossed my arms over my chest and delivered the final ultimatum. I told her that $500,000 requires a financial audit. I told her she could take me to the back office right now and open the books, or I would walk out to my car and she could explain the delayed shipping container to Jeremiah herself. Aaliyah was completely cornered. She was suffocating under the weight of Bryce's illegal wire transfers and the imminent collapse of the family empire. She looked at the exit, then looked back at me. The desperate need for survival overrode her terror of exposure. Her shoulders slumped in total defeat. She nodded silently, turned around, and began walking down the narrow fluorescent-lit hallway leading directly to the executive accounting office. The executive accounting office was a jarring contrast to the decaying warehouse we had just walked through. The air conditioning blasted at a frigid temperature, preserving the scent of expensive leather and polished mahogany. Aaliyah rushed to the main terminal, her manicured fingers trembling as she typed in the master passcode. She pulled up a sanitized profit and loss statement, printing it out and sliding it across the massive desk with a forced, brittle smile. She pointed to a specific line item, claiming it was the delayed customs fee she had mentioned earlier. I did not even look at the paper. I pushed it aside and stepped around the desk, standing directly over her shoulder. I told her I did not want the summary. I demanded the raw line-by-line general ledger for the past 12 months. I wanted the accounts payable, the outgoing wire logs, and the physical authorization slips. Alia's breath hitched. She protested, her voice shrill, claiming that level of access was restricted to the chief financial officer. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the wood, reminding her that a $500,000 cash injection required absolute transparency. I leaned down, bringing my face inches from hers, and told her to open the files, or I was walking out the door. With a shaking hand, she clicked the mouse, opening the master financial logs. My eyes scanned the endless rows of digital data. Running a high-volume premium restaurant means managing razor-thin margins and complex supplier networks. My brain was hardwired to track supply chain capital. I bypassed the standard logistical expenses and focused entirely on the miscellaneous vendor payouts. It took me less than 3 minutes to spot the hemorrhage. Starting 8 months ago, massive irregular wire transfers began flowing out of my father's corporate accounts into a triad of obscure LLC holding companies. They were categorized as independent contractor fees and emergency fleet maintenance. But I recognized the names of the LLCs instantly. They were the exact same offshore shell companies my private investigator had flagged in the dossier that morning. The money was not going to shipping vendors. It was flowing directly into Bryce's severely over-leveraged real estate firm. I ordered Aaliyah to open the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and hand me the physical authorization slips for those specific transfers. She sat frozen in the leather chair, completely paralyzed by terror. When she refused to move, I stepped around her, yanked the heavy drawer open myself, and pulled the corresponding red folders. I flipped through the thick stack of paper. Every single $1 million transfer required a wet signature from the company patriarch. I stared at the dark blue ink at the bottom of the pages. It spelled out Jeremiah Wilson. But the stroke was entirely wrong. My father always signed his name with a harsh, aggressive downward slash on his T. These signatures were perfectly meticulously horizontal. They were carefully practiced imitations. I dropped the stack of forged documents onto the desk. The sound cut through the silent office like a gunshot. I looked at my younger sister, the golden child, the flawless society wife. She was completely bankrupting our father. Jeremiah thought he was losing money to the global economy. He had absolutely no idea that his favorite daughter was systematically looting his remaining cash reserves to fund her husband's failed real estate ventures and maintain her own lavish lifestyle. She was draining his lifeblood to keep her designer wardrobe and her country club status intact. I stated the facts out loud, my voice devoid of any emotion. I laid out the exact timeline of her embezzlement. I watched the last remaining shred of Aaliyah's fake sisterly persona dissolve. She did not try to deny it. She broke down, her face twisting into an ugly mask of panic and resentment. She spat out that I did not understand the pressure they were under. She claimed Bryce had made a few bad investments and the banks were threatening to seize their primary estate. She justified stealing from our father by stating Jeremiah was too old and too stubborn to understand modern finance anyway. She insisted they were just borrowing the money and were going to put it all back as soon as Bryce flipped his next commercial property. Her pathetic rationalizations were cut short by the sound of the heavy oak door swinging open. Bryce stepped into the executive office. He wore a sharp charcoal gray suit, his hair perfectly styled, radiating the polished arrogance of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. He started to ask Aaliyah if the transfer had cleared, but the words died in his throat. He stopped dead in the center of the room. His eyes snapped from Aaliyah's tear-stained, terrified face down to the open general ledger on the computer screen, and finally rested on the scattered pile of forged authorization slips covering the mahogany desk. I watched his sophisticated country club facade shatter. The charming, diplomatic son-in-law vanished instantly. His jaw clenched, the muscles ticking violently beneath his skin. His eyes went flat and dark, calculating the absolute ruin staring him in the face. He realized in a fraction of a second that I had seen the cooked books. I had seen the embezzlement. I held the power to send him to federal prison for corporate fraud. Bryce did not say a single word. He slowly turned around, grasped the brass handle of the office door, and pushed it firmly shut. The heavy click of the industrial deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a thunderclap in the confined space. He turned back around and began to slowly advance across the room. He did not look at his wife. He kept his predatory gaze fixed entirely on me. Aaliyah shrank back into her chair, pressing a hand over her mouth, completely useless. I did not back away. I stood my ground, my spine rigidly straight, even as Bryce stepped into my personal space, physically backing me against the edge of the heavy wooden desk. He loomed over me using his height and broad shoulders to block out the overhead fluorescent light. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the sudden sharp scent of his adrenaline. He leaned down, placing both hands on the desk on either side of my hips, effectively caging me in. His voice was a low, dangerous growl, completely devoid of his usual manufactured charm. He informed me that I had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. He stated that nobody was walking out of this office today with leverage over him. He demanded that I sit down at the computer and initiate the $500,000 wire transfer immediately, but he did not stop there. He leaned closer, his face inches from mine, and delivered his ultimate demand. He told me I was going to sign a legally binding ironclad non-disclosure agreement regarding everything I had just seen. And to guarantee my absolute silence, he demanded I sign over the 20% equity stake in Sable and Smoke right here, right now. He swore I was not leaving that locked room until he had my restaurant and my silence permanently secured. I did not flinch. I did not attempt to shove his heavy shoulders away, nor did I break eye contact to look at the locked door. I simply maintained a cold, dead stare. Slowly, with deliberate and practiced precision, I raised my left hand from the deep pocket of my trousers. I held my smartphone directly between us, tilting the illuminated screen so the harsh overhead fluorescent light caught the display perfectly. The call duration timer glowed bright green against the dark interface. 22 minutes and 14 seconds. The line was live, unmuted, and connected directly to the senior partners at my corporate law firm in downtown Atlanta. I kept my voice perfectly level, projecting my words clearly toward the device's microphone. I stated my location for the record, identifying the exact address of the Wilson Global Logistics warehouse. I calmly informed my legal team that my brother-in-law Bryce had just physically cornered me against an office desk. I narrated his exact physical position, noting that he had intentionally locked the only exit. I requested that the recording immediately flag his demand for a forced equity transfer and a coerced non-disclosure agreement regarding the forged corporate ledgers resting inches from my left hand. I looked back up at Bryce, my expression devoid of any fear. I told him that if he moved even one fraction of an inch closer to me, the partners on the line were instructed to immediately dispatch the police. I informed him that the situation would instantly escalate from simple white-collar financial fraud to felony false imprisonment, kidnapping, and corporate extortion. Bryce froze entirely, The predatory aggressive posture evaporated in a millisecond, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His eyes darted from my face to the glowing timer on the phone screen, calculating the catastrophic reality of his situation. He had just confessed to corporate espionage and threatened a business owner on a recorded line with elite corporate litigators, listening to every single syllable. He stumbled backward, as if the mahogany desk had suddenly caught fire. He threw his hands up in the air, physically demonstrating his retreat, his breathing shallow and rapid. In the corner of the office, Aaliyah let out a sharp, pathetic whimper. She was curled into the leather executive chair, her hands covering her face fully, realizing that their entire empire of lies had just been legally documented. Her manufactured tears from the restaurant had been replaced by the genuine hyperventilating panic of a woman staring down federal indictments. Bryce backed up until his shoulder blades hit the heavy wooden door. His hands were shaking violently as he fumbled blindly behind his back for the brass deadbolt. The heavy click of the lock disengaging echoed loudly in the tense silence of the room. He pulled the door open, clearing the path to the exit. But his massive, fragile ego simply could not allow him to surrender in total silence. He could not accept being systematically dismantled by the sister his family had always dismissed. As I gathered my purse and stepped away from the desk, Bryce leaned against the doorframe, his face twisting into a mask of venomous hatred. He hissed that I had not won. His voice trembled with desperate rage as he launched into his final retaliatory threat. He told me that my restaurant was sitting on prime commercial real estate property, currently managed by a subsidiary shell company that his firm heavily influenced. He swore that he would leverage every remaining connection he had to absolutely demolish my commercial lease. He promised to fabricate structural zoning violations, call in corrupt municipal inspectors, and aggressively price me out of the building before the week was over. He stated that I would not have a restaurant left to protect, guaranteeing that Sable and Smoke would be shuttered and chained by Friday morning. I paused in the doorway, stopping mere inches from his sweating face. I offered him a sharp, pitying smile. I told him he could not afford to buy a cup of coffee right now, let alone bribe a city inspector to break a multi-million-dollar commercial lease. I stepped past him, marching out into the silent, stagnant air of the dead warehouse. I did not look back at the office. I walked straight down the center aisle of the facility, the click of my heels echoing off the empty pallet racks, projecting absolute authority. I pushed through the heavy exterior doors and stepped back out into the blistering Georgia heat. I slid into my vehicle, locked the doors, and instructed my legal team to secure the audio files and prepare the preliminary fraud injunctions. The evidence was locked down. The trap had snapped shut. Fast forward to Thursday evening. The atmosphere inside Sable and Smoke was electric, vibrating with a high-stakes, meticulously controlled tension. The restaurant was completely closed to the general public. Tonight was the apex of the Atlanta social and political calendar. I was hosting the mayor's exclusive private fundraising dinner. This was not merely a catering gig. It was the most critical reputation-defining night of my entire culinary career. The dining room had been transformed into an elite fortress. Security personnel in dark suits flanked the entrances, murmuring quietly into earpieces. The tables were draped in crisp, heavy white linens, adorned with low structural floral arrangements of dark orchids and white roses. Crystal glassware caught the ambient, moody lighting, sparkling flawlessly. The guest list was a concentrated concentration of absolute power. State senators, local political titans, massive philanthropic donors, and the city's most untouchable wealth were currently taking their seats. Inside the kitchen, the temperature was soaring. The massive stainless steel ranges roared with blue flame. I stood at the central expediting station wearing a pristine double-breasted white chef's coat, my hair pulled back into a severe, immovable knot. I was the general commanding an army. My line cooks moved with synchronized, silent precision around me. We were executing a bespoke 7-course tasting menu designed to secure my position as the undisputed culinary force in the region. If tonight went perfectly, I would secure the political backing and the elite social armor necessary to make myself entirely untouchable. I would build a fortress of influence so powerful that Jeremiah, Vivian, and Bryce could never hope to breach it. I wiped a single bead of sweat from my forehead and called out the first round of tickets. The searing sear of diver scallops hitting hot cast iron filled the air. The heavy swinging doors to the dining room pushed open, letting in the low, sophisticated murmur of Atlanta's most powerful elite. The battle for my survival had shifted from the loading dock directly to the dining room, and I was absolutely prepared to serve them perfection. The pacing of the kitchen was a flawless, synchronized ballet. My expeditor called out the final tickets for the main course, and my line cooks responded with sharp military precision. We were plating a butter-poached Wagyu ribeye over a bed of smoked parsnip puree, finished with a reduction of black garlic and bone broth. It was a dish that demanded absolute focus, and my brigade delivered perfection. Through the circular glass porthole of the kitchen doors, I could see the dining room. Sable and Smoke was operating at its absolute zenith. The low, warm lighting reflected off crystal wine glasses and polished silver. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with Atlanta's political royalty, elite venture capitalists, and the most notoriously unforgiving food critics in the Southeast. I wiped down the rim of the final plate with a pristine white towel, gave a sharp nod to my front-of-house manager, and watched as a procession of servers carried the main courses out into the dining room. They moved in perfect unison, lowering the plates simultaneously in front of the guests. A collective murmur of appreciation rippled through the room. I took a deep breath, the scent of searing meat and fresh thyme filling my lungs. I had spent years clawing my way up through brutally abusive, male-dominated kitchens, enduring the constant mockery of my own family to build this exact moment. This restaurant was my empire, and tonight the fortress walls were impenetrable. I untied my apron, smoothed down my crisp, double-breasted white chef's coat, and pushed through the swinging double doors. The moment I stepped into the dining room, the conversation naturally ceased. A spontaneous wave of applause broke out, rolling from the corner booths all the way to the mayor's head table at the center of the floor. I walked forward, keeping my posture perfectly straight, absorbing the validation that I had been denied my entire life. I reached the front of the room and accepted a glass of champagne from my sommelier. I raised my glass, the crystal catching the light. I delivered my speech with a calm, unwavering authority. I spoke about the foundation of Sable and Smoke, framing it not just as a restaurant, but as a testament to resilience and the power of a shared table. I thanked the investors who had believed in my independent vision when others had laughed at it. I looked directly at the food critics, thanking them for pushing the culinary boundaries of the city. Finally, I turned to the mayor, acknowledging his relentless support for independent female entrepreneurs in Atlanta. The room hung on my every word. For the first time in my 34 years, I was not the estranged, difficult daughter. I was a titan in my own right. I concluded my toast, took a sip of champagne, and handed the floor over to the mayor. He stood up, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, his charismatic smile instantly commanding the room. He raised his own glass and began to speak, his booming voice echoing off the mahogany walls. He praised my tenacity. He called Sable and Smoke a beacon of cultural and economic revitalization for the downtown district. He declared that Atlanta needed more leaders with my exact blend of uncompromising grit and absolute dedication. He was halfway through his brilliant, politically charged compliment when the heavy custom brass front doors of the restaurant violently crashed open. The sound was like a bomb detonating in a cathedral. The heavy mahogany doors slammed against the interior vestibule walls, sending a harsh, jarring echo over the mayor's booming voice. A rush of bitter cold night air invaded the warm, perfectly climate-controlled dining room. The mayor stopped speaking mid-sentence. The elegant hum of the room instantly flatlined into a shocked, breathless silence. Every head in the restaurant turned toward the entryway. Bryce marched through the vestibule, leading the charge. He had shed his tailored business suit for an aggressively casual, dominant look, wearing a dark trench coat over a black turtleneck. He wore a smile of absolute malicious triumph. Directly behind him walked my father, Jeremiah. The patriarch of the Wilson family looked around my packed, successful restaurant with an expression of cold, detached disgust. He did not see his daughter's life work. He only saw an obstacle in his way. Flanking Jeremiah was my mother, Vivian. She was draped in her signature pearls and a heavy mink coat, her face pulled into a tight, judgmental scowl. She looked at the elite politicians and critics in the room as if they were peasants intruding on her private property. Rounding out the family formation was Aaliyah hiding behind her husband's shoulder, clutching her designer handbag, playing the role of the nervous, innocent bystander to absolute perfection. Trailing immediately behind my family were three massive uniformed men. They were not Atlanta police officers. They wore the tactical gear and heavy utility belts of private building security contractors. My own private security detail moved to intercept them, stepping into the center aisle to block their path. Bryce did not even slow down. He shoved his hand into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy plastic badge attached to a lanyard, aggressively shoving it directly into the chest of my head of security. He loudly announced that he was the executive representative of the commercial property management firm that owned the entire block. He ordered my security to step down immediately or face felony obstruction charges. The sheer audacity of the intrusion paralyzed the room. State senators and wealthy donors sat frozen in their plush leather chairs, their forks suspended mid-air. The journalists in the room immediately recognized the brewing scandal, their eyes darting rapidly between my family and me. Bryce pushed past my security team and marched straight to the center of the dining room. He intentionally placed himself directly between me and the mayor, invading the central focal point of the event. He wanted the audience. He needed the public humiliation to be absolute and undeniable. He reached inside his trench coat and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. The papers were bound in stark red legal folders featuring the unmistakable seal of a corporate litigator. Bryce held the documents high in the air, ensuring every single person in the room could see the official seals. He turned his body, slowly projecting his voice to the furthest corners of the restaurant. He declared with a loud theatrical boom that I was in severe, unmitigated breach of my commercial lease. He weaponized the legal jargon, spitting the words out like venom. He announced to the mayor, the critics, and the investors that Sable and Smoke was operating under gross financial negligence. He claimed I had violated the fundamental covenants of the property agreement, citing fabricated structural damages and unauthorized commercial usage. He slapped the thick stack of legal papers violently down onto the mayor's table, directly disrupting the pristine white linen. He looked me dead in the eye, his smile twisting into a sneer of pure vindictive hatred. He raised his voice even louder, announcing to the silent captive audience that my lease was officially and irrevocably terminated. He declared that the premises were being seized immediately by the property management firm. He turned his attention to the mayor, offering a mockingly polite bow, and advised the politician to finish his expensive wine quickly because the building was being entirely evacuated and chained shut before midnight. The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy, choking the life out of the room. The clinking of crystal silverware and the low, elegant hum of background jazz completely vanished. State senators stared with their mouths slightly ajar, their political instincts frantically calculating the fallout of this public ambush. The city's most feared culinary critics sat perfectly still, their eyes darting from Bryce's flushed, triumphant face to my own, taking mental notes of a spectacular culinary triumph rapidly devolving into a hostile corporate takeover. The mayor stood frozen next to his half-empty champagne flute. His private security detail immediately tensed, their hands dropping to their radios, uncertain how to handle a commercial property dispute, disrupting a highly secure private event. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic hum of the kitchen exhaust fans behind me. Vivian stepped forward, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She adjusted her heavy mink coat, her face radiating a smug, predatory satisfaction. She was absolutely vibrating with a toxic, vindictive joy. This was the exact moment she had waited for since I packed my bags and walked out of their mansion 10 years ago. She wanted this public humiliation. She desperately wanted to watch her rebellious, ungrateful daughter get dragged out of her own establishment in front of the city's most elite power brokers. She leaned closer to Aaliyah, whispering something that made my sister offer a small, wicked, highly practiced smile. Jeremiah could not contain himself. The patriarch of the Wilson family thrived on dominance, and the stunned silence of the dining room was his ultimate cue to take center stage. He pushed past a bewildered city councilman, his face purple with rage and absolute vindication. He pointed a thick, manicured finger directly at my face, yelling over the frozen crowd. "I told you you'd amount to nothing without me. You should have signed the deal." His voice was a harsh, abrasive bark that shattered whatever decorum remained in the restaurant. He genuinely believed he had won. He firmly thought this brutal public execution of my career would finally force me to crawl back to his failing logistics empire, begging for a place at his table. He thought stripping me of my life's work would finally bend me to his will. Bryce did not waste another second letting the family gloat. He turned to the three massive uniformed private security guards looming near the vestibule and gave them a sharp, commanding nod. He ordered them to clear the dining room immediately. The guards stepped forward in unison, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. They began approaching the tables, gruffly instructing the mayor's guests to abandon their 7-course meals and exit the premises. A low murmur of outrage and confusion began to ripple through the wealthy crowd. Heavy leather chairs scraped aggressively against the floorboards. Political aides frantically reached for their cell phones, attempting to manage the rapidly escalating disaster. Bryce marched the final few steps toward the expediting counter. He closed the distance, invading my personal space just as he had done in the warehouse office days ago. He raised the thick stack of legal documents and shoved the eviction notice violently into my chest. The heavy red folder struck my sternum hard, forcing me to take a half-step backward to maintain my physical balance. He leaned in, his breath hot against my face, his eyes wide with a manic, unhinged energy. He muttered that I was finished. He told me to take off my white chef's coat and walk out the back door into the alley before he had his guards physically throw me out onto the street in front of the local press. He demanded my keys and my absolute surrender. I did not stumble. I did not drop the heavy red folder. I did not reach into my pocket for my phone to dial the Atlanta police and beg for an intervention. I stood perfectly still, my spine rigid, absorbing the physical push and the venomous threats with absolute, unshakable calm. I looked down at the eviction notice pressed against my chest, feeling the sharp edges of the paper through my uniform. Then I looked back up at Bryce's sweating, triumphant face. I wanted him to commit entirely to this public execution. I needed him to dig his grave so deep that he could never climb out. I slowly raised my right hand, holding it up in a silent, commanding gesture that instantly demanded the room's attention. I did not look at my father. I did not acknowledge my mother's gloating expression. I turned my head slightly toward the long mahogany bar running along the left wall of the restaurant. I caught the eye of my lead bartender, Marcus, who was standing completely frozen with a cocktail shaker gripped tightly in his hand. I gave him a subtle, practiced nod and calmly signaled for my usual. Marcus snapped out of his shock. Moving with the rapid precision I had trained into him, he swiftly filled a crystal highball glass with sparkling water and a sharp twist of lime. He walked it over to the expediting counter and handed it to me. I took the glass, the ice clinking softly against the crystal rim. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the carbonation burn the back of my throat. I swallowed, lowering the glass smoothly back to the counter. The entire restaurant watched me, utterly baffled by my complete lack of panic. Bryce's triumphant sneer began to falter, replaced by a creeping, microscopic shadow of doubt. I bypassed Bryce entirely, completely, ignoring his confused, angry glare. I looked directly past my gloating mother, looked straight past my screaming father, and focused my attention entirely on VIP Table 4. Sitting alone at that table was a white-haired man in a bespoke midnight blue suit. He had not touched his butter-poached Wagyu ribeye. He had not reacted to the shouting or the security guards. He had simply sat back in his leather chair, his hands steepled under his chin, watching the entire spectacle unfold with cold, clinical, merciless precision. He was the chief executive officer of Bryce's commercial real estate firm. Arthur Sterling placed his heavy linen napkin on the polished mahogany table. The movement was entirely devoid of urgency, executed with the practiced, chilling grace of a man who held the fates of multi-billion-dollar portfolios in the palm of his hand. He pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the floorboards, a harsh grating sound that somehow managed to slice right through the ringing silence of the dining room. He stood up to his full height. He was a tall man, impeccably tailored, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying authority. He calmly buttoned the center button of his midnight blue suit jacket, his eyes locked entirely on his junior executive. Bryce turned his head toward VIP table 4. The transformation was instantaneous and violent. The arrogant, venomous sneer melted off his face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his cheeks so rapidly, he appeared physically ill, his skin taking on a sickly ashen hue under the warm restaurant lighting. His hands began to shake violently. The heavy red legal folders he had just slammed onto the mayor's table slipped from his slick, sweating fingers, hitting the floor with a pathetic, muffled thud. The papers spilled out across the pristine floorboards, completely ignored by the stunned political dignitaries sitting inches away. Arthur did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He spoke with a cold, metallic precision that carried perfectly across the paralyzed room. He instructed Bryce to stand down immediately. He ordered him to stop making a humiliating public spectacle of their corporate firm and to instruct his rented security guards to step back into the vestibule. The words hit Bryce like physical blows. Bryce took a staggering step backward, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He frantically gestured toward the scattered papers on the floor, stammering out a desperate, disjointed defense. He frantically claimed he was simply executing a lawful eviction, citing the firm's strict protocols, desperately trying to justify his unauthorized invasion of a private, highly secure political event. He pleaded that he was only protecting the firm's investments. Arthur offered a smile entirely devoid of warmth. He stepped away from his table, clasping his hands behind his back as he walked slowly toward the center of the room. He informed his junior executive in front of the entire assembly of Atlanta's elite that his information was catastrophically outdated. He stated that their commercial real estate firm had absolutely no legal standing in this building. He coldly announced that they did not manage the property, they did not hold the lease, and they certainly possessed no authority to evict the current tenant. Bryce shook his head, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape from the tightening noose. He argued that the property was the crown jewel of their downtown portfolio. Arthur cut him off with a single sharp hand gesture. He revealed the truth that had been buried under layers of ironclad non-disclosure agreements. He announced that the firm had quietly liquidated the entire commercial block 3 weeks prior. The property had been sold in its entirety to a private silent holding company known as Onyx Holdings, LLC. The revelation hung in the stifling air of the dining room. Bryce stared at his CEO, his brain completely short-circuiting as it tried to process the impossible reality. Jeremiah and Vivian exchanged a look of pure bewilderment, their smug anticipation evaporating into raw confusion. I set my crystal highball glass down on the expediting counter. The sharp clink of the glass drew every eye in the room back to me. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored chef's coat. I withdrew a crisp, folded stack of heavy parchment paper, the incorporation papers for Onyx Holdings, LLC. I unfolded the documents with deliberate, excruciating slowness. I walked around the counter, stepping directly into the center of the dining room, stopping mere inches from where the fraudulent eviction notices lay scattered on the floor. I held the official state registry documents up for the entire room to witness, ensuring the embossed gold seal of the state was perfectly visible. I looked directly into my father's confused, enraged eyes. I stated clearly and unequivocally that I was the sole proprietor and managing director of Onyx Holdings. The silence in the restaurant deepened, thickening into a heavy, suffocating pressure. I did not break eye contact with Jeremiah as I explained the reality of his situation. I told him I had not merely built a successful restaurant, I had built a financial empire right beneath his notice. I detailed how Bryce's firm had been facing a severe, undisclosed liquidity crisis. I explained how my holding company had stepped in, leveraging the massive profits from my restaurant group to buy their distressed debt entirely out from under them. I turned my gaze to Bryce, who was currently trembling violently, sweat pouring down his forehead and soaking the collar of his black turtleneck. I informed him that I was not just a tenant holding a commercial lease. I was the absolute owner of the brick, the mortar, and the ground he was currently trespassing on. I was his landlord. The realization struck the family like a physical shockwave. Vivian let out a sharp, genuine gasp, her manicured hand flying to her throat, her pearls clicking together loudly in the quiet room. Jeremiah's face turned an alarming shade of crimson, his mouth opening in a silent roar of denial, as his brain rejected the fact that I had outmaneuvered him on a corporate level. Aaliyah took 2 rapid steps backward, physically distancing herself from the impending blast radius, her eyes wide with mounting panic. They were completely paralyzed with shock. But I was far from finished. The battle for my survival required complete, total eradication of their power. I turned back to the expediting counter and retrieved the heavy red leather dossier I had secured from the warehouse, the very same ledger that had sent Bryce running in terror 3 days prior. I walked back to the center of the room, weighing the heavy dossier in my hands, holding the absolute destruction of Jeremiah's legacy. I turned my back on my family entirely and addressed the mayor and the assembled VIP guests. I opened the red dossier, revealing the meticulously organized, legally authenticated bank records and wire transfer logs. I spoke with the clinical detachment of a forensic accountant. I broke down step by agonizing step exactly how Bryce and Aaliyah had systematically drained the financial lifeblood out of Wilson Global Logistics. I detailed the establishment of the offshore shell companies. I recited the exact dates and dollar amounts of the fraudulent vendor invoices that had been funneled through dummy corporations. I exposed the hidden equity transfers, the falsified tax documents, and the forged corporate ledgers that masked the bleeding revenue. I stated the final devastating total. They had successfully embezzled over $3 million from Jeremiah's personal and corporate accounts over the past 4 years. I walked over to the mayor's table and gently placed copies of the forged ledgers directly in front of him and the chief of police, who was seated immediately to his right. The evidence was irrefutable, undeniably accurate, and now entirely a matter of public record. Jeremiah whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto Aaliyah. The sheer betrayal in his expression was catastrophic. Aaliyah immediately burst into violent, hysterical tears. The perfectly maintained facade of the innocent, supportive wife completely shattered into pieces. She shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at Bryce's chest. She sobbed that it was entirely his idea, that he had forced her to sign the documents, that he had physically threatened her if she did not comply with the embezzlement scheme. She threw her husband to the wolves without a single moment of hesitation to save her own skin. Bryce realized the trap had snapped permanently shut. He spun around, his eyes locking onto the heavy brass doors of the vestibule. He lunged forward, desperately attempting to sprint out the back door and disappear into the night before the authorities arrived. Arthur Sterling moved with terrifying speed. The CEO stepped directly into the aisle, physically blocking Bryce's escape path. Arthur grabbed Bryce by the lapels of his trench coat and shoved him hard against the mahogany-paneled wall. Arthur stated, his voice a low, dangerous growl, that the Atlanta Police Department was already en route, summoned by the firm's legal team the moment the financial fraud was independently confirmed. The high wail of approaching police sirens began to echo down the downtown streets, growing louder by the second, signaling the absolute end of their reign. Vivian's knees buckled. She collapsed heavily into an empty leather dining chair. Her pristine, untouchable social image had just been publicly incinerated in front of the exact political and financial elite she spent her entire life trying to impress. She sat completely motionless, her eyes vacant, staring blankly at the scattered fraudulent eviction notices on the floor, fully realizing she was now married to a bankrupt man. Jeremiah Wilson. The untouchable titan of logistics realized his life's work had been utterly hollowed out by the golden child he had chosen over me. The empire he had sacrificed his own daughter to protect was entirely gone, stolen by the very people he elevated. He dropped heavily to his knees in the center of the dining room. His heavy shoulders shook as he looked up at me. The arrogant patriarch was completely broken. He reached a trembling hand out toward the daughter he had consistently abused and discarded. He begged me to intervene. His voice broke as he pleaded with me to bail them out, stating that I had the money, the holding company, and the influence to save the logistics firm from total liquidation. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his weathered face and claimed that I owed them for everything they had done. I looked down at the man kneeling on the polished hardwood floor of my dining room. Jeremiah Wilson, a man who had built his entire identity on the absolute subjugation of his family and his employees, was now a hollow, sobbing shell, grasping at the crisp fabric of my chef's trousers. He had the unimaginable audacity to invoke a debt. He dared to speak of owing after a lifetime of systematically attempting to erase my very existence. I did not step back. I did not flinch or offer a hand to help him up. I looked down at him with a glacial, undisturbed calm. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to stew in the radioactive humiliation of his public collapse. When I finally spoke, my voice was not raised. It carried no anger, no hysteria, and no desire for validation. It was the voice of absolute, unassailable authority. I reminded him of a freezing Tuesday night 10 years ago. I painted the picture for the silent, captivated room, detailing how I had stood in the foyer of his sprawling mansion with a single duffel bag begging for a small loan to keep my catering business afloat. I reminded him of how Vivian had watched from the top of the sweeping grand staircase, sipping a martini, while he opened the heavy front oak door to the freezing rain. I leaned down, bringing my face inches from his sweating, tear-streaked cheeks. I repeated the exact words he had spat at me before slamming that door in my face. Failures do not belong in this family. I stood back up, straightening my posture, towering over him. I told him with a voice that rang like a steel bell that I did not owe him a single dime. I owed him absolutely nothing. I stated that his logistics empire was currently bleeding out on the slaughterhouse floor entirely due to his own blind arrogance and his pathetic desire to enable a golden child who had ultimately gutted him. But I was a businesswoman. I informed him that I would purchase Wilson Global Logistics out of bankruptcy. I would buy the remaining assets, the commercial contracts, and the fleet for pennies on the dollar. I told him I was doing this strictly to save the pensions and the livelihoods of the hundreds of drivers, warehouse workers, and dispatchers he had so recklessly endangered. I looked at his wide, desperate eyes. I delivered the final, fatal blow. I told him that while I would save the company, he was completely, irrevocably fired. He would hold no title, he would retain no shares, and he would never set foot on a corporate property again. I did not wait for his response. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. The sound echoed sharply. My private security detail moved with synchronized, ruthless efficiency. They descended upon the Wilson family. 2 guards hoisted Jeremiah roughly from the floor by his armpits, dragging the weeping, broken patriarch toward the exit. Another guard flanked Vivian, giving the screaming, thrashing woman no choice but to stumble backward toward the vestibule. Arthur Sterling's men had already secured Bryce Frog, marching the terrified, hyperventilating executive out the rear service doors to await the arriving police cruisers. Aaliyah scrambled blindly after her husband, her expensive heels slipping on the scattered, useless eviction notices. The heavy brass doors swung shut, sealing them out into the cold night. For 3 long seconds, the dining room remained trapped in a stunned, breathless vacuum. Then VIP Table 4 erupted. The CEO of the real estate firm stood up and began a slow, deliberate applause. The mayor immediately followed suit. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was on its feet, a deafening, thunderous roar of applause shaking the crystal glasses on the tables. I gave a single respectful nod to my guests, turned on my heel, and walked back into the roaring heat of my kitchen. The subsequent months played out exactly as the forensic accounting dictated. The legal hammer fell on Bryce with catastrophic speed. The federal indictments for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and grand larceny were ironclad. His expensive defense attorneys abandoned him the moment the stolen funds were frozen. He was currently sitting in a federal detention center facing a mandatory minimum sentence that would ensure he spent the prime years of his life behind bars. Aaliyah's survival instincts kicked in, but her lack of practical skills left her entirely stranded, completely cut off from the frozen family accounts and facing massive civil liabilities. Her pristine manufactured lifestyle evaporated. She was forced to take a minimum wage job at a high-volume retail clothing store in a discount strip mall. She spent her days aggressively folding discounted sweaters and enduring the complaints of impatient customers forced to swallow her pride while wearing a polyester uniform that she would have previously mocked. Jeremiah and Vivian faced a reckoning that dismantled their entire reality. Without the logistics company revenue and with their personal assets seized to satisfy the massive embezzlement debts, their sprawling custom-built mansion fell into immediate foreclosure. The banks moved in, stripping the property of its custom furnishings and luxury vehicles. They were universally shunned by their elite megachurch community. The public scandal of the fraud, combined with the spectacular humiliation at my restaurant, rendered them absolute social pariahs. The very people they had desperately tried to impress now crossed the street to avoid them. Stripped of their wealth and their status, they were forced to rent a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Vivian spent her days staring blankly at peeling linoleum walls, mourning her lost country club memberships, while Jeremiah sat in a worn recliner, physically diminished and haunted by the daily crushing shame of his golden child's actions. Meanwhile, my empire expanded. The acquisition of Wilson Global Logistics was finalized flawlessly. I liquidated the unnecessary corporate overhead and completely overhauled the fleet. I rebranded the massive transport trucks, painting them a sleek matte black with the subtle silver emblem of sable and smoke. The trucks that once hauled industrial freight for my father were now entirely repurposed, transporting premium locally sourced produce, fresh coastal seafood, and bespoke culinary supplies exclusively for my rapidly expanding restaurant group. I had turned his failing legacy into the very engine that fed my success. Exactly 1 year later, the atmosphere inside Sable and Smoke was vibrating with a triumphant, undeniable energy. We had completed a massive expansion, doubling the square footage of the dining room and adding a private glass-walled tasting room overlooking the kitchen. The reservations were booked solid for the next 14 months. I stood at the edge of the expediting counter, the ambient noise of the kitchen washing over me in a familiar, comforting rhythm. The heavy, polished bronze of a James Beard Foundation award rested securely in my hands. It was the highest culinary honor in the nation, recognizing not just the exceptional quality of my menu, but the sheer uncompromising force of my independent vision. I looked out over my kitchen. Marcus was effortlessly managing a packed bar, laughing with regular clients. My sous chefs were moving with that same synchronized, flawless precision plating dishes that pushed the absolute boundaries of modern cuisine. I looked at the diverse, dedicated, relentlessly loyal staff moving around me. This was my true family. This was a brigade built on mutual respect, shared sacrifice, and the pursuit of absolute excellence. There were no golden children here, only those willing to put in the work. I ran my thumb over the engraved lettering on the heavy bronze metal. I thought of my grandfather, the only person who had ever truly seen my potential before he passed. I remembered his quiet, steadfast advice, the words that had guided me through the darkest, most abusive years in my parents' house. He had always told me that independence was the single greatest form of security a person could ever achieve. He was entirely right. I set the award down on the steel counter and signaled Marcus for a glass. He poured a vintage deep red Cabernet, handing it to me with a wide, knowing smile. I walked to the glass porthole of the kitchen doors and looked out past the packed dining room, gazing through the large front windows. The glowing, sprawling skyline of Atlanta stretched out into the night, a glittering testament to ambition and survival. I took a slow, deep sip of the heavy, complex wine. The warmth spread through my chest, settling into a profound, unshakable peace. I had not merely survived the fire my family had so desperately tried to burn me with. I had harnessed that exact flame, contained it, controlled it, and used it to cook my absolute masterpiece. The greatest lesson here is that true security comes from absolute independence, not toxic family ties. When those meant to protect you try to tear you down, you must become your own savior. Your worth isn't defined by people who consistently underestimate you. Instead of seeking validation from a broken family dynamic, channel that pain into building your own unshakable empire. Blood does not dictate loyalty, and the family you choose will always outshine the one that seeks to control you. Have you ever walked away from toxic relatives? Share your story below and subscribe for more empowering content.